Hi there! Welcome to Pallet University. As you might have noticed, I've been a little bit absent on the channel for the last week or so, maybe 2 weeks, and that's for a very specific reason. As you may or may not know, I am currently in a master's degree program studying paleontology, and part of that master's degree is what's called a master's thesis. It's essentially coming up with a real long paper, a scientific study, and presenting it and, writing up, an entire paper about it. My thesis is about I have a bit left of editing to do. I have a bit editing left to do, so it'll end up somewhere between 120 and 130 pages. So it's a lot of work, but basically at the end of it, once you're essentially done, you give a presentation that is open to the public, and then the members of your advising committee or research committee sort of grill you about sort of the actual science of what you did after you present it, and that part's private. But the actual presentation part is open to the public. So we recorded it, and that's what the bulk of this video is. A couple things before I actually get into that, though. Because nobody that's on that Zoom call that we recorded knows that I'm putting this on YouTube, just for security reasons, I'm going to be blacking out their names. If their faces show up, I'm going to be covering those up as well. And also, at one point, there's a map that shows where the locality that I work with is located. That's going to be blacked out just because I don't like giving out maps to fossils, just because, not that I think any of my regular viewers would go plunder fossils from this place. That's just something I don't feel comfortable with, so that will be blacked out as well. And lastly, let me know if you have any questions about it, because since this is literally what I do for a living, I would love to answer any questions that you might have about it, so please let me know those down below. I guess with that, let's get into it.
Welcome to the master's thesis defense for Gavin Davidson. Gavin comes to us from the State University of New York in Cortland, New York, where he got a Bachelor of Science. He was a double major in geology and biology, which is pretty impressive, all right? And Gavin has spent the last 2 years working on a very important fossil fauna from a site called the Mission Pit. That's a sort of mid to early late Miocene fauna, and so he's done a descriptive thesis, which are often very tedious, very time consuming, often a lot more work than a lot of other stuff, but he's done a fantastic job with it. So with that, I am just going to turn it over to Gavin. Yep, and you should share your screen and go on ahead.
All right, so can everybody see that okay? Okay, so yeah, like Dan said, we're going to be talking about a really interesting fossil locality called the Mission Pit from South Central South Dakota. The title of this work is A Taxonomic Review and Chronologic Correlation of the Fossil Assemblage from the Mission Pit locality from the Clarendonian of South Dakota. So just a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to go through some of the background of the site, some of the geologic context, and some of its sort of historical context. The actual methods that I used for the study, what those methods yielded in terms of results, and then some of the conclusions that we can draw from those results. So the Mission Pit is an old gravel quarry, sort of in south central South Dakota, as you can see here. And it's about 8 to 10-ish miles northeast of the town of Mission, which you can see here, just north of the border of Pallet and Todd counties, down in, like I said, south central South Dakota. The approximate location of the pit itself is about right here. So some of the geologic information, it's a little varied from what I could find. I kept finding different names for the actual name of the deposit. Some works called it the Thin Elk member of the Valentine Formation. Some called it the Thin Elk member of the Ash Hollow Formation. Some just called it the Thin Elk Formation itself. But all of them agree that it's a channel deposit, like a channel lag deposit specifically, from, like I said, the early late or late early Miocene. But back in the 1950s, it was an active gravel quarry. And as such, as they were quarrying this gravel in about 1958, they started seeing all these bones just sort of falling out of the, the walls of this pit that they were quarrying. So they called School of Mines and they sent out J.R. McDonald, who was the director of the museum at the time. And it turned out it was a fairly diverse assemblage of, lots of these critters that were around at the time that we'll get into a little bit more detail on some of the actual animals that were kicking around at this time. But some of the collection methods were less than ideal. There are pictures of it, but I was unable to find one to actually put in here. But essentially, because this gravel, company, they weren't going to stop their economic operation just to let some of these pesky scientists get in there. So they continued quarrying all this gravel out of the pit. And the field team had to sort of pick through the gravel as it was on a conveyor belt to be crushed for further processing to be used in things like roads, concrete, things like that. And so they were picking it off the conveyor belt and even sort of raking through the scrap pile after the sediments and fossils had already been through the crusher. And due to that, and also the fact that it's just a channel lag deposit in general, all of the fossils from this locality are very, very disarticulated. There is not one, even associated really skeleton, nothing even approximating that. So that would have made this work a little bit easier. However, it was still doable with the material at hand. So some of the animals that are actually kicking around here. So it was, like I said, a pretty diverse assemblage containing members of 11 macromammalian families. There were 3 families of sort of micromammalian that represented by micromammals, basically things like rodents, lagomorphs, things like that. They weren't really included in this study just because the material, just by the nature of how it was collected, was less than ideal and not very usable for proper identification and fine scale use for this kind of study. And in the original work published by MacDonald in 1960, it was determined to be Clarendonian in age. And it was further refined by Webb in 1969 to be late Clarendonian. However, he didn't really specify what that meant. So that was sort of one of the goals of this study. The main goal of this study is to figure out exactly when in the Clarendonian, if it even fell in the Clarendonian at all, where it fell. And so a brief short background about what the Clarendonian is and why I'm not just saying, one of the, ages or stages of the Miocene, why we're talking about these land mammal ages instead of some more stratigraphic units. So like I said, the Clarendonian is what's called a North American land mammal age, or NALMA. And they're essentially just a different way of breaking up time rather than, using fossils and, the appearance and disappearance of certain fossil taxa instead of using stratigraphy like you would for some different stages on the geologic timescale that we're more familiar with. So that's sort of what we're working with here. And the last sort of complete review of this fauna was from Tabram for his master's thesis from the School of Mines in 1981. And if you know anything about this sort of time period, A, there were a lot of horses running around, and B, a lot of work has been done on horses has been done after this. So this fauna was in some pretty severe need of a bit of a makeover, essentially. And so we're going to be revisiting some of these. These are names of other faunas that we will be comparing the mission pit to, but we will get to those later. And so, like I said, this is more of a descriptive study than an actual hypothesis testing study. But it was sort of thought that the mission pit was a CL2, the middle of the 3 stages of the Clarendonian that you can see here. And so that's one of the main goals, was to determine whether that was actually the case or whether it falls somewhere else in the Clarendonian. So what kind of animals would you expect to see around this time? This is an excellent artist rendition of the fauna from the mission pit. You can see some of the proto Black Hills sort of in the background here. And this was made for the American Museum of Natural History, actually. So the artist did obviously a very beautiful job. And you can see some really neat animals here. You see a dog here. At the time we had the bone-crushing Borophagine dogs. We have a couple rhinos in the front here. Some relatively small horses, which, like I said, were very, very common, very diverse at the time. We have some gomphotheres, some elephant cousins, but not all that closely related to elephants, as well as some camels right here in the back. And what this photo doesn't show, that is also represented by the Mission Pit fauna, are some bear dogs, some amphicyonids. We have one species of them in the fauna. We have just a single isolated tooth from a felid, a isolated jaw section from a tapir, some peccary material, mostly jaw and dental material, also jaw and dental material from some oreodonts, and also lastly some antilocaprids, your pronghorns, and their relatives. So going through some of the methods, what was actually done to these fossils? Well, first, before any kind of comparison to those other faunas could be done, I had to make sure that the fossils that I was looking at were actually what we were calling them. So I had to go through and collect all of the relevant diagnoses for the taxa that were represented previously by the Mission Pit, and also some of their contemporaries, some of their relatives, just in case they weren't what they were originally referred to, so that I had something else to sort of cross-reference that with if they were not, in fact, what they were originally referred to. Then I had to actually go into the collections at the School of Mines and examine each specimen and compare each one to its respective diagnosis that I thought was appropriate. After that was done for all of the specimens in this collection, I just compiled all these updates into a new fauna list. And then using that new fauna list, I sort of collected fauna lists from some other faunas, around the Great Plains, and then also a couple more toward the West Coast as well, from approximately the same time. And I used the past paleontological statistical software. And I used it to perform cluster analyses using the Jacquard, Simpson, and Kolchinsky similarity indices. And I did a bootstrap of 10,000 or 100,000 just to make the data more robust, to make it as robust as possible, just because with some of these descriptive studies, because they're not hypothesis testing, sometimes they can get a little bit of scrutiny for not really having any true statistical methods. And while cluster analyses are not true statistical methods, I figured having a really high bootstrap value would make the data more robust. So what did they actually tell us? Not just the cluster analyses, but just sort of the examination of the fauna in general. So most of the original referrals did not really change all that substantially. The biggest changes were sort of refining some of these taxa. For example, the species of Neohipparion, a species of horse from this time, it was just referred to the genus Neohipparion, whereas through the study, it has been refined to be the actual species Neohipparion ephine. That was the actual bulk of the things that were changed. There were a couple genus level changes in referral, but there was, I believe, only one of those. And speaking of that one, it was mostly with this particular genus here, Nanippus. So Nanippus was the second most abundant in terms of just number of fossils referred to it in this collection. And nearly all of them turned out not to be Nanippus. Well, actually, all of them turned out not to be Nanippus, but most of them were referred to in Pseudohipparion gratum, another similarly sized horse from the time, whereas some were referred to Hipparion T. Hanense, again, a slightly larger horse from the time as well, but Nanippus was not found to be in this locality, which might actually have led to Webb, if you remember from a couple of slides ago, Webb referred the Mission Pit to late Clarendonian. Nanipus might be the reason for that, because Nanipus doesn't show up until the latest part of the Clarendonian, and is much more well known from the Hempylian, the land mammal age immediately after the Clarendonian. So that might have been part of the reason for Webb referring it to the late Clarendonian. Another really interesting thing that I thought was worth pointing out was some teeth that were originally referred to Pliohippus, not any particular species of it, but just to the genus. Through this examination, it sort of looked like they showed a mix of traits between Pliohippus and Dinohippus, a genus that is fairly closely related to Pliohippus. They showed a interesting mix of traits that are traditionally associated with each of those respective genera. So potentially, this could be a transitional population. That's an interesting claim that I think should be looked more into, but that was a little outside the scope of this particular study. So I just thought that that was worth mentioning. And the mission pit fauna was determined, in fact, to be CL2 in age. But what lines of evidence actually led me to that? So one of the most and likely the most complete sort of review of North American land mammal ages to ever be written was written by Woodburn in 2004, and the section regarding the Clarendonian was written by Tedford et al. Also in 2004. And it lists each sort of subsection of every Nauma that he is sort of working with in that particular subsection of that volume. And he lists each subsection with taxa that are diagnostic or particularly indicative of each sort of subsection. And many of the ones in the mission pit are very, very diagnostic of CL2. For example, that Neohipparian affine is diagnostic of CL2, whereas in the following section of the Clarendonian, the CL3, it is much more likely that you find a different species of Neohipparian, Neohipparian trampescens. And that's also the case with a couple of the other horses. For example, Pseudohipparian that I mentioned earlier. In this collection, there is Pseudohipparian gratum, whereas in CL1, you find Pseudohipparian retrusum, CL2, like I said, you find Pseudohipparian gratum, and CL3, you find Pseudohipparian skinneri. So it's just differences in the species, and a lot of the species, like I said, from the mission pit are very indicative of CL2. And specifically, mission pit specimens of this, the one genus of bear dog that we do find, Anthocyonid, Ischirocyon gidlei, show morphology that is pretty consistent with CL2. For example, this particular species is well known from the Barstovian, which is the Nauma immediately preceding, so immediately before the Clarendonian. And throughout its time, throughout the Barstovian and the Clarendonian, there's a really interesting and consistent track in a couple of morphological features. Number one is the metaconid on the lower first molar gets reduced over time until in the CL3, the latest Clarendonian specimens, it is essentially gone, basically not observable at all anymore. In the specimens from the mission pit, it is still observable, but is very reduced. So that to me indicates that it is not CL3 at least. And then also, as you can see here, with this big alveolus for the carnassial tooth, that is the first molar. And then this alveolus right here would be for the second molar, and there is no spot right here for a third molar. That is pretty indicative of middle to late Clarendonian specimens of this particular species, that by the middle Clarendonian, they just no longer have a third molar in their upper dentition. So between it lacking an M3 and also still having the lower first molar metaconid, that those combined sort of tell me that this is a CL2 population. And those cluster analyses performed in past also support this as well. So we're going to take some time and go through those. So quickly, before I actually talk about the actual figure, I'm going to talk about some of these other faunas that I'm comparing the mission pit to. So first is the Clarendon fauna. It is from the panhandle of Texas and is mostly considered CL2, with a small section of it that is referred to CL3. So middle Clarendonian into late Clarendonian. The Minicaduza fauna is from northern Nebraska and is early CL2. The Burge fauna is traditionally very closely associated to the Minicaduza fauna. Geographically, they're very close to one another. And the Burge fauna is traditionally referred to the CL1, so the earliest part of the Clarendonian. And then we get into some of the West Coast faunas. So the Black Hawk Ranch fauna is, like I said, from the West Coast and is referred to CL3, the latest part of the Clarendonian. And Dove Spring fauna is also from West Coast and referred to HH1, the earliest part of the Hempilian, so right after the Clarendonian ends. So with that, the Mission Pit compares most favorably to the Clarendon fauna. This particular figure is using the Jacquard similarity index. And while the bootstrap value is relatively low, that just sort of tells me, in combination with the rest of the bootstrap values being relatively high, that the Mission Pit fauna just doesn't, the software doesn't quite know where to put it. But with the other data being so robust, you know, a 98 score for the Burge and Minicaduza faunas falling out together means that at least the Clarendon is very separate from these two, and the software compares it best with the Clarendon, although obviously it is not a perfect fit. Next, we have the Simpson Similarity Index, and I just think it's particularly worth noting that this is the Simpson Similarity Index and not the Simpson Diversity Index. There is, if you look up Simpson Index online, you will find much more literature about the Simpson Diversity Index. They're two different Simpsons. So it took a little bit of digging to actually figure out some of the math behind this one. But using this method, the Minicaduza fauna compares most favorably with the Mission rather than the Clarendon fauna. So this, to me, in isolation, this one would sort of indicate that the Mission Pit is earlier CL2, but still CL2. After that, compares most favorably with the Burge fauna and then the Clarendon fauna, as well as having the West Coast faunas being more disparate from this whole group as a whole. And this pairing seems to make more intuitive sense, just sort of geographically, with, you know, the Mission Pit being southern South Dakota, and these two, the Burge and Minicaduza faunas, being northern Nebraska. Geographically, they're just very close together, so that might be skewing these results a little bit. Whereas the Clarendon fauna, like I said, is on the Texas Panhandle, which is still a plains environment and also was at the time as well. But geography might be playing a bit of a role here. And also the bootstrap value for the Mission Pit and Minicaduza fauna also is relatively low, once again saying that the software doesn't necessarily know what to do with the Mission Pit, but you know, this is where it thought that it would fit best, where the math said it would fit best. And then lastly, we have the Kolchinski Similarity Index, where the Mission Pit once again falls most closely with the Clarendon fauna, with a bootstrap value of about 51, and the Similarity Index also not saying that they're incredibly similar. It's only about 0.5, whereas 0.1 would be, you know, exactly the same. But it compares, again, most favorably with the Clarendon. Burge and Minicaduza faunas fall out relatively close to each other. And once again, the West Coast faunas also pair very well with one another. So out of the three of these, with two of them comparing the Mission Pit most favorably with the Clarendon fauna, that sort of leads to the Mission Pit likely falling somewhere in these two sections here, either the middle or late CL2. The fact that it compares really favorably with the Minicaduza fauna, like I said, might be some kind of an artifact of geography, but this is sort of what all of the combined data say between the the cluster analyses, the morphology differences in that Ishiro-Scion specimen, and also just some of the comparisons through that Tedford volume. So, with some of our conclusions, the mission pit is a CL2 fauna. That was pretty much the entire goal of this study to begin with. And I think the data at hand, they pretty confidently suggest that mission pit does indeed represent a CL2 fauna. Further work is sort of suggested on those pliohippus teeth just because they were really weird and interesting. And the fact that this might be a potentially transitional population of pliohippus into dinohippus might warrant more looking into, just because dinohippus is known to sort of show up around this time, perhaps a little later than CL2, but that would be interesting to find out a little more on. And then also something that I kind of noticed as I was just sort of working with all of these, specifically the horse teeth, was that each taxon tended to have certain preservational qualities that I couldn't figure out a proper reason for. For example, one taxon, the cementum on the teeth would be sort of almost an orangish color and kind of chalky, while the enamel would be almost black. And then on another species, the cementum would be very, a lot harder, a lot more compact, and also kind of like a grayish color, while the enamel was almost a dark blue. And you would think, since they're all in the same depositional environment, that they would have much more similar preservational qualities. But it was interesting that they didn't. So that might warrant some future note as well. And lastly, with the acknowledgements, I'd like to say a really big thank you to, through COVID, 3 of my 4 semesters at Mines have been sort of dominated by COVID, which has just added a ton of stress to everybody. So I'm sure that, advising through COVID hasn't been, all that easy compared to a regular year. So just thank you for your understanding and flexibility with everything. Dr. and Dr. for being as members of my committee and helping me actually produce some, good quality science. And lastly, to the School of Mines and the Museum of Geology for access to specimens and workspace, and also, TA-ship and funding to allow me to continue actually, doing the study. Lastly, here are some of my references, and with that, I will be happy to take some questions.
Very good. Thank you, Gavin. And again, we'll open the floor for questions. And again, I'll reiterate what said in the last one. Those of you on the committee sort of save your deepest probing questions for the closed session. Don't blow all your questions on this section. So questions for Gavin.
I have a question, Gavin.
Yeah, go ahead.
So that was interesting that there was really low support in the cluster analysis for any other reference fauna. Do you have any idea of why that might be? Do you think it's driven by geographic differences, environmental differences, or maybe, I don't know, collection bias because of the non-ideal setting of that those fossils were collected from? Or I don't know, is there anything that you've noticed like unusual about the fauna just going through all this stuff?
Yeah, I would say definitely the collection bias would probably be the largest factor there, just because, anything that wasn't teeth or podials basically didn't make it through. I would say at least half of the specimens, probably more than half, are individual isolated teeth. And when it comes to a lot of non-equid mammals, teeth are very helpful, but they can only get you so far. Skull material would have been so much more helpful. And also, I excluded in these analyses anything that was referred only to the genus level, just because, that could be, there's, I think, 3 species of Hypohippus, that are around, but there's only like, if I have a specimen that's only referred to the genus, how do I know what species that is? And the collection bias and also the depositional nature of this as well just leads to all these banged up fossils that aren't as easily referable. So if I had more, better quality material, I might be able to get more species level referrals, and that might help some of that resolution.
Thanks.
Yep.
Hey, Gavin. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. I've been staring at these cluster analyses, and certainly the biggest division seems to be West Coast and not West Coast. So maybe one thing you could say about these two places where you plot with the Clarendon is aren't the other two, the Burge and I don't know how to say the M word.
Minicaduza.
Minicaduza, those are geographically closer, right?
Yes,
And
they are.
So perhaps you are getting an age signal between the Clarendon and Mission Pit because it's counter to what you would expect for biogeography.
So these two being so close is sort of artificially throwing the Mission Pit closer to the Clarendon is
No.
what you're saying?
No. All things being equal, I would because your first big division is West Coast and central to the U.S., I would expect the Mission Pit to group somehow with those two northern Great Plains localities, but it doesn't, right? It groups with the Texas locality.
Right.
So that might bolster your age determination some.
Yeah, and that's why I said that it seems like it's more later CL2 just because it doesn't compare as favorably with the Minicaduza as it does the Clarendon. But yeah, that's sort of why I said, this sort of section here is still CL2, but the sort of later, the closer comparisons to the Clarendon sort of leads me to believe that it's sort of later to mid-late CL2.
Yeah, I just want you to not apologize so much for your 51 and 49% and things like that. That's what I'm trying to get you not to do.
Okay. All right.
Because I think you do have a stratigraphic signal in there because it's counter to what you would expect with biogeography.
Right. Okay.
Never apologize for your data, so, especially as a paleontologist. Other questions for Gavin? All right, then with that, we will retain the committee, and the rest of you all can take off. Thank you so much for coming.
And in case you were wondering, I passed. So I am with an asterisk because I've not officially graduated yet, but I'm now a Master of Science in Paleontology. And it's been a crazy couple of years. Maybe I'll make a longer video about just grad school in general. But yeah, if you want to know anything about either my research or just grad school, please let me know down below. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. But yeah, thanks for sticking with me. I appreciate you all. Make sure to follow me on Twitter as well at Pallet_U to keep up on all things Pokemon science. As well as if you feel like this content is worthy of supporting financially, we do have a Patreon link, which will be down below. As always, an incredibly massive shout out to our supporters over on Patreon, Patty Murphy and Sam McCarty. Your support, as always, means the absolute world to me. You all know that. And you all have been super understanding with sort of the lack of content on Patreon the last, little bit too, while I've been working on my thesis. So I appreciate y'all more than you could ever know. And lastly, thank you so much for watching. And as always, there's a time and place for everything.